Welcome to My Brother's Keeper, the television program that tells you what is happening in the world in relation to threatened Christian communities in the Middle East, in Africa, and in Western Europe too. My two colleagues, Professor Jeffrey Kaplan and Virág Lőrincz, are here to tell us their plans for looking at the situation faced by Catholics in 6 different countries. They're going to be going to those countries, and the next port of call is going to be Iraqi Kurdistan. Iraq and Iraqi Kurdistan are in, I would guess, the kind of information we currently possess. Before you go, some of the areas, some of the countries where Christian communities are most threatened. This is the result of civil wars, ISIS, a series of emigrations and immigrations. And so we have to therefore be cautious at this point about what you're going to find. But you will be looking at people at every level, from government officials to people in displaced persons camps and so on. So my first question would be, given the confusions, can you give me, Virág, a good idea of what the current religious breakdown is in Iraqi Kurdistan and in Iraq too?
Regarding our research, it's very important to take a look at the demographic landscape of the country and also the religious landscape. So as for demography, the country has more than 40 million inhabitants. And out of that, the population of Christian people is more than 150,000. So it has a quite big Christian population, but we also have to note regarding the religious landscape of the country that it's ethnically diverse, and the majority of the people are Shia Muslim, and also it has within the population Sunni Muslims as well.
The number of Christians may be quite substantial, but it's a dramatic fall, isn't it, from the past?
It is indeed. We have to recall the memories from history in order to understand that. So the Iraqi Christians are one of the oldest continuous Christian communities in the world, since Christianity was brought into Iraq in the 1st century. However, since then, if we just take a look at the First World War and the events of the First World War and the Turkish regime in the area, we have to see that the Christian community decreased significantly, and they lost over half of their members. And it meant that there were some territories within the country which lost 1/3 of their Christian population.
And of course, Kurdistan, as its name implies, is composed mainly of Kurds, and those Kurds are themselves denied a country of their own until now, and secondly, have difficult times with neighboring countries, in particular with Turkey and with Syria.
Yes, and it also has an impact on the situation of Christians, because after the territorial losses of ISIS, there were other threats, especially in the Iraqi Kurdistan region. Just to mention the Shia militias backed by Iran, and also the Turkish airstrikes, which made the Christians soft targets to attack.
Now, could I ask Jeffrey at this point to explain how these circumstances came about, the background politically and militarily in recent years?
Well, it's a deep question. I think Virág gave us a pretty good outline. The situation with Iraqi Kurdistan itself is, as you say, the Kurds have wanted an independent state for a very long time, and nobody else in the Middle East wants them to have an independent state, particularly right now, Turkey. And so Iraqi Kurdistan is autonomous but not independent. They exist with Iraq in an often very uneasy situation. The conflict with Turkey is much sharper. There have been airstrikes, as Virág says. There have been ground attacks. Christians are primary targets of this, perhaps not intended, but it falls on them. So we see a overall fall in the Christian population from 300,000 in a decade ago to, at this point, 250,000 as of 2021. And there are great fears both in Iraqi Kurdistan and in the Middle East that the population of Christians, one of the oldest historical churches in the world, may disappear entirely.
And so you have, on the one hand, a threatened country. Kurdistan is itself in a precarious position. And secondly, threatened Christian communities within that community. And indeed, you say, occasional bombings of villages, including Christian villages. So the question is, what are the legal circumstances, what legal protections do Christian communities have in Kurdistan, and what practical defenses do they have?
The legal landscape of the country leaves Christian, especially Christian women, particularly vulnerable due to the fact that they don't really have any kind of legislation about against domestic violence. Although I have to mention that in the Kurdish region, they had in 2011 a legislation against domestic violence. However, despite international pressure, they don't have the same kind of protections for women in the Baghdad-controlled territories.
And it's not just women, is it? Because the men too find themselves Christian men in peculiarly difficult circumstances.
Yes, indeed. And I would like to emphasize that there are differences. I mean, there are similarities as well, but also differences in the case where when we are talking about the gender-specific religious violence.
Virág, we have evidence about that, don't we? And not just about women.
We have to be aware that the different forms of violence against Christians is also based on gender-specific issues. Here I would like to shortly reflect to the words of Juliana Teimuradze, who is the founder and the president of the Iraqi Christian Relief Council and also a former Nobel Peace Prize nominee.
There are so many stories that I can tell you, but something that really I don't hear much being talked about is the dignity factor, human dignity, especially when it comes to men. When we were distributing these packets, the first man, when he came to me to collect the packet, he didn't look at me. His head was down. The second man, when he came to pick it up from me, I asked for his name, and he whispered it, and he ran away. That is the moment that it hit me. These men, their dignity has been stripped away from them. They weren't able to defend their families. They weren't able to defend their children. They have lost everything. And here is a woman from the West who has brought them aid, and they don't even have the money to go and purchase what they need. They have to heavily rely on the goodness of charity organizations. And that is something, ever since 2016, I came to become aware of the loss of dignity and the massive depression that men specifically have been fallen into.
That's the case, isn't it, in both in Kurdistan itself, but also in the refugee camps, where many of these the Christians have fled and continue to flee. Perhaps I could turn to Jeffrey at this moment and ask about the rate of exiles and what is happening to them and how and whether or not we should pursue the policy of attempting to assist them where they live, or whether we should facilitate their movement to other parts of the world, because where they live is where their homes have been, their traditions are, and as you say, where they're some of the oldest traditions in the Middle East.
There are two waves of migration to Kurdistan by Christian refugees. One was 2014-2015, after the ISIS campaign largely wiped out Christian communities in southern Iraq. And they fled north to Kurdistan and to the Nineveh Plains, where they have settled. That's one wave. The second wave has come in from the conflict in Syria. And so you have two very different groups of people. In all cases, but especially in the case of the IDPs, the internally displaced persons, it's vital to keep Christianity as a tradition in Iraq itself, in Kurdistan itself, in the Nineveh Plains themselves. And to do this both there and virtually every other country we've been looking at, it does require development. Hungary Helps does a great deal of this as one agency of the Hungarian government, going into specific localities, listening to the people themselves about their needs, and trying to create at least the beginnings of economic infrastructure that would allow men to make a living and women and families to be able to live in a safe, secure environment. The second wave, the Syrian refugees, whatever their religion, are in very dire straits. The situation in the camps is not good. The rates of sexual assault and sexual violence is extremely high in those camps. And frankly, nobody wants to take them. There's nowhere for them to go.
Thank you for correcting my slip of the tongue about exiles from and to, but we're talking about people going in for refuge in Kurdistan here. That raises the question of how that is received, how that exile flow is received by non-Christians in Kurdistan.
The IDPs have been, and perhaps Virág can correct me in terms of gender violence, have been relatively well received because their numbers are relatively small. They were going into communities that were primarily Christian to begin with. And so the absorption process wasn't as difficult. The refugees coming in from Syria is a completely different, something completely different. In either case, there are very high rates of violence in Kurdistan. The Kurdistan government has tried to address this, but they have so many security concerns between what's happening with the Shia militias in the south, what's happening with the Turks, that this kind of internal security is a very formidable challenge. When we get to Kurdistan in a few weeks, one of the groups and people that we will be interviewing is one of the Peshmerga commanders, and he'll be able to give us much more detail on the security situation, both for the refugees and for Iraqi Kurdistan as a whole.
Can you give us some information about aid, where it comes from, who delivers it, and how effective it is? I mean, we've seen a moment ago someone describing the aid from a specifically Christian organization. But what about official aid, government-to-government aid?
I don't really have the statistics on that. I'm not sure how significant it is. You have the United Nations, you have various Western donor states, but honestly, I don't have that information.
In not many countries, I think, have taken the view that they believe that the aid should be delivered in situ, where the people live, and in this case, where some of the exiles from Iraq also live. But Hungary hasn't it? Hungary's attempt, mentioned by Jeffrey, is specifically designed to create circumstances in which the communities can be protected and assisted there.
Yeah, the essence of that is exactly how you just said, is to handle the situation there and try to solve the roots of the problem. And another challenge or issue which we would like to deal with when we are doing our research is the situation of those Christians who were converted from Islam, because those people are particularly vulnerable.
Now, another source of vulnerability, again, is sexual. And we heard this about the situation from concerning men. What about the situation concerning women? Again, we have some evidence of that, don't we?
Yeah, and once again, I think Juliana Tamaruzzi would be a very good source to begin the discussion.
I want you to put yourself for a moment in the shoes of a Christian woman who used to host a feast on Sundays for her family, who had a beautiful garden that she used to plant vegetables in. And now for many years, these refugees were caught in storage containers, literally 12 feet storage containers without a window, in a camp, in a large camp, without having their home, without having their garden, without having their family. The families are torn apart. So that's another form of emotional abuse that has been they have been affected by. So women have suffered in one way by seeing their husbands fall into massive depression, by seeing their husbands turning to gambling, for example, or alcohol use, or just remaining silent. Children, I can't tell you how devastated my community is by calling this generation the lost generation.
As she points out, the situation is corrosive in that it feeds on itself. The deprivation and lack of resources, lack of employment for men is reflected on the women and the children. And whether you're talking about Iraqi Kurdistan or anywhere else, that leads to high levels of frustration, which leads to high levels of domestic violence, which leads to high levels of sexual abuse. In what has been reported also in Kurdistan in terms of women is that Christian women are, as Virág points out, particularly vulnerable in that they don't wear hijab. And so they're perceived as being sexually available. And that creates very high levels of sexual harassment to the point that some Christian women have started wearing hijabs. Others, there was a campaign, which was actually quite interesting, to get Christian women to wear headscarves in imitation, as they said, in imitation of Mary. But again, it was the underlying motivation here was security.
Now, in Western societies, we can presumably say to men of all kinds who treat a woman who's dressed in a conventional Western or certainly non-Islamic way, we can insist, even though we don't always do this, we can insist that they should respect that and treat them with due respect. Is it impossible to do that in the circumstances of the camps, to actually, in a sense, firmly educate the men that these women are not sexually available? What protections of that kind that work can you tell us about?
It's a kind of different situation maybe within the camps, because that's a very close community. But just to mention the constitution of Iraq, it states that the state religion is Islam, but it also expresses the freedom of religion. And in this case, although it is not forbidden to convert from Islam to Christianity, because of the fact that they apply Islam principles, it is not working in practice. And so it makes those people who are converted especially vulnerable, not just in their private life, for example, the way that they cannot express freely their faith, yes, but also it has an effect on their family lives. So if there is, for example, there is a Muslim woman who converts to Islam, it is not officially recognized by the authorities. So the children will be registered as a Muslim.
Well, let me turn to Jeffrey and ask in a way the same question to begin, and that is disrespecting women who are not dressed as you would wish is not a principle of Islam, is it? It's not a teaching of Islam.
No,
it's a cultural background. And so, in a sense, what prospects are there of changing this cultural attitude?
Let me go back a bit,
Yeah.
because when I first went to the Middle East, and this would be to places like Iran in the 70s, to Saudi Arabia in the 70s, 80s, it was very common to see Western women or women dressed in Western clothes being sexually harassed. And it wasn't an Islamic issue. It was a cultural misunderstanding,
Yes.
made not because of religious reasons, but because of media, because of movies, because of television series. And they looked at the behavior of Western women in those series, and they assumed that all women behaved that way. So on the one hand, it was a cultural misunderstanding. It later, whether you're talking about Egypt or Kurdistan or other places, it took on a more hostile tone. It took on a more sexual tone, and it took on a more religious tone. And they put the three together, and you ask them, why did you do that? And they'll say, oh, because they're not. Or they're not because they're not Muslim, because they're not dressed correctly. But but all of the reasons are mixed together in a way that make no sense even to the perpetrator. Only time will address this.
And of course, there are worse cases than Kurdistan by far, aren't there? We were discussing Sudan on another program, and
Sure.
and that is a case where mass rape has become a weapon of war and of subjugation. But you were about to say something more, I think, on the situation cultural situation in Kurdistan.
Yeah, it's something that is also reflective of a disrupted political situation, of a disrupted economic situation. I think, again, in fairness, you see attacks on Muslims in Western countries, in Europe or the United States, because of the way they're dressed. It's not something that happens only on one side, but it's much more pervasive in the Middle East.
It's much more pervasive, and it is, again, this is a question, it's more pervasive. Is it, however, punished? I mean, that is to say, are the legal situation and the practical expression of law, does that actually have an impact on protecting the virtue of Christian women?
But there are some parts of law, of course, which are protecting women as well. But as I mentioned previously, for example, a very big issue, which is domestic violence, that is not efficiently detailed. Like in the Kurdish region, there is a legislation regarding that, but in the Baghdad-controlled areas, despite the international pressure, they don't really have proper legislation for that.
Yeah, the Women's Health Journal, as far back as 2013, did a survey and reported that in the area, roughly 45% of women reported intimate partner violence, and 21% reported sexual violence. And those are only those who can report, because women do not report in these areas because of the impact on family, on their own status.
One has to remember, of course, that there was an epidemic of rape at the end of the Second World War as well by the victorious armies in Europe. So I think I agree with you. We don't want to, in a sense, unduly emphasize the religious aspect of this. It's there, however. Now, final reflections on what you intend to look at, particularly, Virág, in your case, when you get to Kurdistan.
Yeah, the main point of taking both men and women into Kurdistan within the framework of our research is to be able to do the deep interviews and to try to understand more deeply the situation of especially women, and not just those women who were originally Christians, but also those women who were converted from Islam. And I think that it's also a very difficult situation, because there are large amount of women who were, for example, taken to sexual enslavement during the time of ISIS. And they have to carry a very heavy burden, and they have to try to somehow go on with their lives. And I find it especially important to try to understand and try to have a view about the life of these women.
Well, of course, that's very important. And what's very important, too, is the degree to which we can assist those women and indeed the men whose plight we also discussed before. Any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, and in terms of the research itself, we've, obviously my brother's keeper is about the Christian communities, and we focused our discussion of that. But in terms of our research, we're talking to all communities. And so we'll be interviewing government officials, military officials, NGOs, the various churches, Muslims in the area, and even while we're going to one camp to talk to imprisoned ISIS prisoners. So the idea is to see the world through the eyes of all involved.
Well, you have taken on a very big task. I wish you well in it. We will be returning at some point in the future when you can present the results of your investigations and research. And in the meantime, I want to thank you both and to say to our viewers, in order to keep track of what my colleagues achieve, tune in, if you would, again, to My Brother's Keeper.
The Middle East, home to the cradle of civilization, retains a reputation from time immemorial as one of the most complex, conflict-ridden regions of the world. A cluster of nations, religions, powers, and influences, Mideast intricacies pose conundrums to even the most astute individuals. Bombarded daily, indeed every minute, by a barrage of information, some accurate, yet most of it less so, TV7 Israel invites you to watch and hear some of the most knowledgeable experts, most of whom partook in creating policies shaping this region today. Join us for Jerusalem Studio every Tuesdays and Fridays for content that truly matters.
We are about to lose the young people. They want a vision. They want to see solutions which may help them to believe that there is a future for them.
Are we succumbing in a slippery slope road to the major crisis? I don't know.
The key issue is leadership and also maybe a lack of national self-confidence.
For more of TV7's productions and editorials, we invite you to visit our website at www.tv7israelnews.com.